Greetings to everyone from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I'm Vice Admiral Bob Sharp, and I'm here with two of my teammates, our Senior GeoINT Authority for Geography and Cartography, Dr. Debbie Fugate, and our National GeoINT Officer for Economics, Threat Finance, and Climate, Dave Burchett. The conference theme of Towards a More Equal Future is a great one, and we've looked at that from a few angles in our discussions. We'd like to focus on something we all need, something that covers more than 70% of the planet, water. But in spite of it being seemingly everywhere, as you all know, potable water is just a tiny percentage of that, and a highly limited resource that causes strife around the planet. That strife can lead to a major national security issue. One recent report dealing with this topic came out from the National Intelligence Council. It's a national intelligence estimate titled Climate Change and International Responses, Increasing Challenges to U.S. National Security through the year 2040. There's an entire section on increased strains over water and migration. And there are some really great tables that explain at a glance the impacts to human security with respect to heat, heavy precipitation and flooding, drought, sea level rise, Arctic ice melt, tropical cyclones, coral reefs, and biodiversity. And with that introduction, let's get into some conversation. Now, Debbie, the theme of Geography 2050 this year is Towards a More Equal Future. How can GeoINT be used to better understand the geographic dimensions of inequality?
So GeoINT is an essential tool for understanding everything that goes on Earth. That includes patterns related to human activity, like the consequences of inequality. And that's right, inequalities can have impacts that can be seen from space. So we can study outcomes like mortality or poverty or water access and gain a better understanding of the scale and the history and the effects of our impacts on the planet. And ultimately, we can investigate even further using GeoINT to get an understanding of changes in both the physical and the social environment and better inform any potential solutions.
That's great. So Dave, how do we define the concept of water scarcity or water-stressed regions?
Water scarcity is a fundamentally dynamic status that changes over time. And we can really break it down by talking about supply and demand. And we can break it down further by talking about water availability versus water access. Water availability is just like it sounds. It's the amount of physical water available in a given region or location. If there's not enough water, that can lead to water scarcity. Access is a different type of situation. You can have an area that has available physical water resources, but they lack the appropriate water management policies or infrastructure to deliver that supply to where the demand is. So as an example, the World Resources Index provides a list of the most water-stressed countries in the world. And unsurprisingly, most of those countries are in the Middle East. The number one on the list is Qatar. But India and Pakistan are also very high on the list as well, and they have very sufficient physical water availability, but they're on that list because they lack the resources and water management policies to effectively deliver that supply to where their demand is.
So based off of what you said, it seems like both distribution and accessibility are unequal around the world. And you hit on this a little bit, but if you can expand on this, how many people in the world lack sufficient access to water? And where's water scarcity a significant issue?
Let's take a look at the big picture. As you said earlier, about 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in water, but 97.5% of this is saline water, mainly in our oceans. Of that paltry 2.5% of Earth's water that's fresh water, the majority is locked up in ice and glaciers or underground. Only a little more than 1.2% of all fresh water is available at the Earth's surface, and most of that is further frozen in ice or in permafrost. By U.S. Geological Survey estimates, freshwater sources such as rivers and lakes only constitute about 1/150th of 1% of total water on the Earth. And those are the sources that most people use every day. Unfortunately, readily accessible freshwater resources in lakes and rivers aren't equally distributed across the world, which generates areas of intense water stress and scarcity. Globally, 785 million people, 1 in 9, lack access to safe water. More than 2 billion live in water-stressed countries, and nearly 3 billion people experience water scarcity at least 1 month per year. By 2025, 2/3 of the world's population may face water shortages.
How does drought factor into this picture of water scarcity?
I mean, drought's a big problem. The UN estimates that in the last 20 years, roughly 1.5 billion people have experienced drought, which has led to estimated economic losses of roughly $124 billion. And as a current example, Brazil right now is experiencing its worst drought in 91 years, which is having major impacts to their economy. First off, hydroelectric power, impacted by lack of sufficient water, provides roughly 2/3 of available self-generated power within Brazil. Secondly, in their agricultural sector, they've seen severe impacts to the production of sugarcane, oranges, corn, and coffee.
It's fascinating, and troublesome, I think, all at once.
I think that those are really sobering statistics, when you hear them. I think it's important to note that geospatial data is really valuable in helping us get behind those numbers and really sort of understand what's going on at the population level.
Yeah.
And then, as Dave said, both more developed countries and less developed countries can suffer from drought. I mean, it's something that's going on globally, but many of the less developed regions are where they are disproportionately affected by this, and they are least unable to cope.
David, let me pull the thread on that a little bit more, because one of the things you said was the geospatial perspective helps you understand what's happening where, right? And to understand these problems from different perspectives and different dimensions. But the important aspect to it is really how it's impacting humans. Right, so how do we explore that problem from a human geography perspective?
Right, so there's a large body of research now looking at water security, or more broadly what I'd call the population water food security nexus. And really at the very basic level, we've got drivers and impacts on both the demand side and the supply side. Now, from a human geography perspective, we know from the research that the interactions amongst all those factors are really strong, and we've got many different push and pull factors at play. So let's step through what that can look like. In some parts of the world today, populations are still growing rapidly, and they're also urbanizing at quite a high rate. So that's a process that they're undergoing that we call the urban transition. That transition brings with it a number of demographic forces. Those demographic forces, they drive up the demand for water. That then diverts water away from agricultural production, which ultimately leads to lower agricultural output and negatively impacts food security. So that's a really basic example, but you can sort of see how they interact with one another. On top of that, urbanization itself contributes to climate change through increased greenhouse gas emissions from processes like land transformation, changes in transportation, those types of things. So we have this environment of insecurity, and it can then drive migration, both internal and international migration, as well as other forms of population displacement when we've got competition for resources going on. And, I think that the bottom line is that we have an environment of inequalities. And we've got all kinds of stresses on the system at various levels, and they can contribute to societal tensions, including conflict.
And one of the things you're highlighting is just the interconnectedness of these issues that we're dealing with. And as you know, our agency provides products and services to inform improved disaster response, humanitarian support, and security issues. Can we also use those resources, those same products and services, to look at inequality from perspectives on how communities respond to and recover from those types of crises that you're talking about?
Sure. So in some parts of the world, populations are still growing rapidly. And in humanitarian crises, disasters, and complex emergencies are often where those inequalities can become the most visible. Now, that could be in terms of unequal access to humanitarian assistance or uneven recovery from a disaster. And in those situations, imagery can be particularly valuable because it can give us greater insights that we can analyze to better inform policymaker response. Now, food security is a good example of that. And I think we have on the screen a graphic showing some flooding in Iran. So you can see in the graphic that over 10 million people were affected by this flooding, and over 40% of the agriculture was impacted by that flooding. And I think it's a great example of how we can use imagery and mapping to determine the extent of flooding in a disaster like that, and the amount of agricultural area that was impacted by that flooding. And we can better understand how that might impact future agricultural output, such as it could delay harvesting, it could delay planting, or it could delay even just transporting crops to the market for sale. And so you can integrate human geography data as part of that analysis and estimate the actual population that's going to be affected by that agricultural impact. You can better understand and estimate the actual number of people that might rely on that particular food supply that has been damaged. And we can better understand what the humanitarian needs will ultimately be. All in all, this will help us develop a better U.S. policymaker response.
Something I really love about what you're saying there, Debbie, it's moving from just responding to being predictive, to estimating what the longer term effects are going to be, and informing decisions and informing actions in advance of those maybe becoming exacerbated, right?
Yeah, and I think it's really important, especially, and you can see in this graphic that we've got a picture of some protests, and it's important to remember that those types of situations where you have food security, it can definitely lead to political unrest.
I like to say that it helps to add context and clarity as to what's happening where and how you might approach solving those complex problems.
Yeah, it's very valuable.
That's great, Debbie. Dave, let's talk about climate change in general. How does NGA help with the global fight against climate change, and how are we looking to address projected future enhanced requirements?
Sure. So NGA's role is in monitoring the impact to the Earth, mainly with monitoring Earth systems as well as populations. And we do that by providing intelligence and foundational data to a wide variety of customers, including both on the policy side as well as departmental, primarily DoD, but also partners across the federal science and civil science communities. Much of that data is provided through our foundation GeoINT, whether it's topographic or in the hydro realms. And that data is used to provide advanced models, both weather, climate, and hazard models. And NGA does modeling work ourselves. Another way we're supporting the mission is through our research department. We're leading on automated sea ice detection in the Arctic.
Hey, Dave, you mentioned partnerships, and as you know, partnerships are key to everything we do. Our strength is our people and our partnerships. Is the climate change mission any different there?
No, not at all. And I would argue that partnerships are more critical to the climate mission than many other missions that we do at NGA. The first factor would be that this is a global issue. We cannot work this in a vacuum and need to be as inclusionary as we possibly can with our wide variety of international academic and scientific partners. not only to just to leverage their added effort to our overall level of effort, but to take advantage of their unique skills, tradecraft, and regional perspectives towards this mission. A second factor would be that the level of expertise, the subject matter expertise on this mission resides overwhelmingly in the open, specifically with our academic and scientific partner. And that creates a two-way dynamic where we need to take full advantage of their expertise and deliver that to our policymakers and departmental customers and consumers. But conversely, we need to do a better job on the government side to ensure that they have visibility to what those requirements are so that they can deliver more robust answers to those requirements. And the third piece, and it's arguably the most critical piece, is that this is a mission that we can do overwhelmingly in the unclassified mission space. Mm-hmm. And what that means to us is that it's an enabler. So when we work inside the SCIF, our most standard hurdles towards partnership and engagement are really policy and IT. And they don't fully go away in the unclassified mission space, but it's a lot easier.
Deb, did you have something to add on the partnerships?
I did. I think I really would like to reiterate what Dave said about the criticality of partnerships. I think it's especially true when we talk about climate change and the science and research that we need to do. Many of the commercial solutions today don't really operate in the spectral range where we need to be doing that science for climate change, and so we often have to rely on some of our civil agency partners like NASA or USGS and some of their satellite capabilities to help us do our science and things that we need to do to meet the mission.
You're always talking about the power of the diversified experiences and expertise and perspectives to help solve some of these complex problems. And one of the things you both talked about is the global nature of this. And I like to say that there's no such thing as local problems. They all cross these regional boundaries, and they have this global dimension to them, right? Requiring global perspective and global approaches to things. And Debbie, you mentioned also that they don't exist in isolation. Some of these problems and these challenges that we're facing. And Dave, can you talk a little bit about climate change, water insecurity, and U.S. national security, and how those aren't isolated, how they are interconnected and interrelated?
Sure. So, water shortages, which are being increasingly exacerbated by climate change, can inflame, local and cross-border tensions, and that can have pretty significant impacts to U.S. national security interests. So, water scarcity in broader regions, especially those transboundary, that's where we're seeing near-term and projected future risks. So, as an example, there are more than 260 rivers and 600 aquifers globally that are shared by 2 or more countries. Most of those are in areas where there is no formal treaty or water agreement. We have one ourselves with the Colorado River, where we have a very outdated water policy both between states and between the U.S. and Mexico. And you see with the 20-year drought in the western U.S. how that's causing impacts to communities and to farming. And those challenges exist on the international stage as well. So while we think climate change will increase risks of water insecurity, there's also the element of the management and the mismanagement of water resources that can exacerbate tensions. I want to pivot at this point back to something you mentioned up front with the national intelligence estimate that the NIC recently produced. It's worth noting that the intelligence community believes that climate change will increasingly exacerbate risks to U.S. national security interests because of the increasing physical impacts of climate. And those include increased and more frequent heat waves, increased and more frequent and longer droughts, increased flooding, increased sea level rise, and Arctic sea ice melt. And all of those things can lead to the potential for increased transnational, transboundary tensions. One issue I'll bring up also is the issue of migration. Where there is a lack of available resources, in particular water or water scarcity, that increases the likelihood of increased migration. And we're already seeing that now, both in Europe and the US, with migration due to economic issues or for conflict. And when you add the possibility of enhanced migration due to climate, it provides an additional stressor on already stressed international systems. And so that increases the possibility for an enhanced demand signal for U.S. aid or U.S. resources in terms of economic, diplomatic, military, or the humanitarian sphere.
That's a great description of how these things don't exist in isolation, how they're interconnected and they have impact on each other, the challenges that we face. And Debbie, you talked about the value of geospatial perspective and understanding what's happening where and understanding these situations. It's visualizing data, right? But to visualize that data and to see the interconnectedness, you have to have data.
That's right.
Right? You have to have the data. Can you talk a little bit about biggest gaps right now in data availability on water resources and flood risk?
Sure. So water data is a particular area where we do have a lot of challenges quantifying both water resources and flood risk, because hydrologic data is difficult to get. It can be of poor quality, or it's just really not available in some places. And so this really sort of exacerbates some of that uncertainty we have in flood risk modeling and better understanding the distribution of water. A major challenge is also groundwater data, such as the water table and aquifer, like Dave was talking about earlier. And data about those are really outdated and just often not available. So recently we did sponsor a National Academies of Science workshop. You'll see here, this is one of the books that we had from that workshop, and it's available to the public. So we believe that this workshop and some of the findings from that will be helpful to addressing the issue. So another significant data gap that we do have is with sort of the hydrologic infrastructure writ large, things like dams and levees. Even in countries that can be quite data rich, like the United States, we can have issues with small scale hydrologic infrastructure data that are missing. It does present a major challenge when we're trying to do things like flood prediction, because infrastructure has a major influence on how floods behave. We do have gauging stations that are important data sources for flood models, again, in the US from many of our civil partners, but around the world from hydrologic institutions. And there are networks available in the United States across all of our river systems, but in other parts of the world, they usually don't have that data, or if they do, it's just very, very limited data.
When you're talking about flood risk and data availability and some of the challenges that we have, what are some of our improvements that you've seen in that realm, adding to the data sources? Either one of you.
Sure. Well, to kind of, double down on what Debbie said, these are extremely complex problems. And so it's pretty vital that we rely on our partnerships to ensure that we have the most sophisticated models available and possible, and to draw on contributions from specifically the scientific community to do so. Accurate and up-to-date models are critical for advanced planning of flood issues, but also for pre-planning for avoiding disaster the next time that we have a water issue like a flood.
Yeah, it just strikes me that it's becoming easier and easier to sense and collect data, and part of the solution may just be raising awareness levels as to, hey, this data is of value if you can collect it, if you can make it available to a broader audience. You can have impact by being part of the solution, by being part of this community. What are some ways that NGA supports the U.S. government in monitoring global water resources to better inform its impact on regional stability?
So I can take that one. So we do provide a significant amount of both environmental data and population data that can be used as inputs to developing different types of models for things like water availability or any kind of sort of water-related natural disasters and floods and droughts that we need to delve into and study in more depth. We also develop analytic tools to improve the data going into those models, and to better incorporate the data into our analysis as well. So it's kind of a two-step system there. And some examples of that might be improving elevation models to conform to real topography and hydrography that can improve the models, estimating better water systems for crop irrigation, monitoring changes in lakes and lake surface water, and creating products that highlight water quality risks in surface water and different sorts of water sources that we have.
That's great, and thank you for that, and thank you both for joining me here today and your comments. Now let me close by just giving a shout out to all our great teammates all across the government, as well as our international partners and all of our teammates in academia and industry. I like to say that we not only have good friends, we have friends who are really good. And it's our privilege to be members of many awesome groups. For example, partnering with the Interagency Water Working Group run by the State Department. And it's definitely our honor to be able to engage with the AGS community. So thanks for the opportunity to be with you all virtually, and we hope to see you next year in person.